I'm Heather Stewart, I'm the political editor of The Guardian. No one wants the job of following John Curtis, but it falls to us, so we will do our best. And this panel is on Britain after Brexit, new political identities. I spend most of the time at the moment sitting down in Westminster watching the Brexit crisis, farrago, drama, whatever it is, unfold in front of me. And the thing that strikes you is that it's been a kind of solvent for the usual political identities, whether that's party identity, which I know there's a panel on later today, or, you know, whether that's sort of left-right identity, or there are all kinds of strange alliances forming. And, you know, it's you watch MPs trying to wrestle with what's essentially a kind of technocratic problem, but they're doing it while trying to channel these shifting currents of opinion that they think they can detect in their constituency. So it's great for me to sort of step away from that and be able to hear a bit more from some actual experts about what's going on out there and public opinion. And, you know, this debate takes place when we sit down in Westminster against the backdrop of extraordinary kind of passions and tensions, and you literally see that every day as you walk in, and there are protesters on both sides who feel incredibly strongly and you know, feel for them that Brexit is an absolutely overwhelming identity, but it's hard to know how much that represents something wider. But it's very strongly felt by politicians, and so much so that Theresa May yesterday, you know, said, I think if we had another referendum, you would end up threatening social cohesion. And she genuinely believes that, and there are politicians on other parts of the political spectrum who genuinely believe that too. So I think it's a good moment to have a look and a think about these sort of political identities and how they have shifted since Brexit. Fortunately, we've got a great panel of people who are much more expert than me, who just sort of sits there and watches it all unfolding. We have, and we'll take people in this order, I think, but I'll introduce everyone. First, we have Paula Surridge from Bristol University. We have Sara Hobolt from London School of Economics, who I think you've heard from already. We have Jane Green from the University of Oxford. And I shouldn't say token man, but we have James Kirkup from the Social Market Foundation. Sorry, James, I'm having to sort of lean in a bit, I think, because the mic doesn't seem to work when I'm over here. So for 5 to 7 minutes each, I've been told, team, I'll start harumphing if you're going over time. Paula, I think you're going to talk about left-right identities a bit. Are you? Let's hear from you first. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Sorry. Just start off with various places you could get hold of more details on this work if you were interested in doing so. But I want to start off talking, excuse me, about the values in the electorate. So, because when I've done these talks in the past, I end up talking at cross purposes with my audience if I don't, first of all, tell them exactly what I'm measuring and what I mean by values. I want to start out just by showing you what I'm measuring before showing you very quickly how this works out in the context of Brexit, but also in the context of the 2017 general election. And I want to show how those two contexts are different, and that as much as it might have swept everything in its wake in terms of our debates, in terms of business at Parliament, in terms of coverage on Sunday politics programmes, actually there are other things still going on in the country in terms of value divides, and were we to go to an early general election, there's no reason to suppose that they wouldn't necessarily play out again. So I tried to use an idea of a value space to think about the electorate, and I do this on the basis of two sets of what academics have called core values. One that measures those kind of, I guess now seen a little bit as old-fashioned economic values that are usually termed left-right, and I won't read through them, you can see on the board there what the measures are. You can see, though, that those measures about the left-right scale are all very much around economics, economic justice. The liberal authoritarian scale, on the other hand, is much more around issues of tolerance, social justice, authority. There's measures that relate to crime. You may have seen research early in the process of trying to understand Brexit that showed how death penalty was a very good marker of whether views on the death penalty was a very good marker of whether somebody voted leave or remain. Now, I use these values to think of a space whereby these two scales are separate from each other. And actually, in the electorate as a whole, they're relatively uncorrelated. So knowing someone's position on economic left-right matters doesn't really help you know what their position will be on liberal authoritarian matters and vice versa. Now, we've seen some work which has suggested that the left-right divide has gone away. And it's absolutely the case that if you want to try and predict whether somebody was a Leave voter or a Remain voter, knowing their position on those economic values is very little help to you. It doesn't predict Leave and Remain voting. The thing that predicts Leave and Remain voting are those liberal authoritarian values. But the left-right values still really matter for predicting which party people voted for in 2017. So this chart, which has got quite a lot of information on it, and I tried to get this message across. What we have, and I've lost some labels off the bottom of it. The dark bars, the solid bars in each case, are the Leave voters within party, and the dotty bars are the Remain voters, because I don't want to be found calling Leave voters dotty. So the Remain voters are the slightly shaded bar there. If you look at this side here, you've got the left-right scale. If you compare the Leave and Remain voters within the red bars, the Labour Party, basically no difference on that scale. And similarly, if you compare the two blue bars, the two Conservative groups, basically no difference on that scale. On the other side, you've got the liberal authoritarian scale, and you can see there that the big differences between those bars, between people's average positions, are on that liberal authoritarian scale. Sorry, I've got the Leave and the Remain back to front now. The dotty bars are the Leave voters. They are dotty after all. The gap there shows you that the one set of voters is much more authoritarian, much less liberal than the other set of voters. Those gaps are big within party. So Labour Leave voters are much more authoritarian than Labour Remain voters, who are much more liberal. The same is also true within the Conservative Party, but in terms of their economic values, they're not any different. Now, there is a tendency to assume that this was caused by Brexit, that everything changed after 2016. This chart shows you that those patterns were present in 2010. Not even 2015. If you go back to the 2010 election, you see exactly the same pattern. Labour and Conservative, Leave and Remain voters, hardly distinguishable but on that left-right scale, equally left-wing on the Labour Party, equally less left-wing on the Conservative Party, and the bigger differences are in those liberal authoritarian dimensions. And I suspect some of my colleagues are going to make similar points, that the divides that the Brexit vote draws on are not entirely new. The salience of those divides is new. I've frequently described Brexit as a wound that had long been there, and ever since the referendum we've been picking at it and making it worse. But actually, the wound itself has much earlier roots. What I want to stress, though, finally, I think I'm doing okay for time, is that if we look at parties across this space that I've been talking about, the key divide is one of left and right. The better predictor of whether you voted Conservative or Labour in 2017 is your position on economic values. The better predictor of whether you voted Leave and Remain is your position on the liberal authoritarian values. So it depends on the question you ask the electorate. Should there be another election? Well, I'm sure there will be another election, just when. Should there be another snap election? Much will depend on what the question is and how that's presented to the electorate, whether or not they continue to be polarised along these left-right divides, which would likely produce a very stable outcome compared to 2017, or whether this other dimension becomes even more important in a new election, which is likely to mess and churn those voters around a little bit. One thing I also want to stress on my final point, so to explain this chart a little bit further, what we have here are three blocks, one which is the left on the economic scale, then the centre on the economic scale, then the right on the economic scale. And within each of those blocks, I've divided according to their position on the liberal authoritarian scale. So if we take this first set of blocks, this first set of bars, which are all people on the economic left. Okay. So these are all people who are, broadly speaking, in favour of Corbynomics. Okay. They are broadly in favour of redistribution, renationalisation, more power to trade unions and so on. But you can see that how strongly they voted Labour in 2017 is very much modified by whether they held liberal views on that other dimension or whether they held authoritarian views on that other dimension. And actually, Labour pick up less than half of the authoritarian left-wing voters. So although they are very much in favour of these left-wing economic policies, they are not voting Labour because it's being modified by this other dimension. So my conclusions here are that values really mattered, and I think values are becoming our new heuristics in many respects. As we've lost attachments to party identities, we use our values as a kind of lens through which we evaluate politicians and policy. But those values are not they're not aligned along a single dimension. I bang my head on the desk regularly when people talk about new centre parties because there isn't a single centre because it's not unidimensional. And how those values come together to influence political behaviour depends on context. The 2017 election was one which really polarised opinions in terms of left and right. It was seen as an opposition between two parties that had each moved further to their respective ends of that spectrum. And as a result, left-right values were really, really important in influencing voting behaviour. In a new general election, very much will depend on the context of that election and how those choices are presented as to whether or not these new Brexit identities become critical or whether actually some of these older divides still structure voting behaviour.
Thanks, Paula. So if you've listened to as many hours of Brexit debate in Parliament as I have, picking at a wound seems quite an appropriate metaphor. So let's hear from Sara Hobolt from the LSE.
Thank you. So this really follows on both from Paula's, but also from John's presentation. And this question of, well, we see that there's really no middle. Yeah, there's no public consensus of a good solution. And what I'm going to try and address is one of the reasons why the public can't really come together in the middle and say, okay, we can't agree, so let's go for Norway, let's go for a soft Brexit, let's go for May's deal, somewhere in the middle. And that also builds on Paula's this idea that it's because people are really looking at what's going on and what they expect of the future through very different lenses. And I will argue that those lenses are really the sort of identities that are built up during the referendum campaign and subsequently along Brexit lines, and that they are, as Paula is saying, very much founded in a value divide, but they've also taken a whole new life of their own. So that's really sort of, if you think of this quote that you might be familiar with, is what you see and what you hear depends a good deal on where you're standing. It also depends on what sort of person you are. And what sort of person we are is partly now also as political beings defined by how we voted and how we see ourselves in relation to the Brexit referendum. And there's a lot of evidence here, and we've been tracking in this project Brexit identities since the negotiations started. And what you'll see is that they're very stable over time. Between 75 and 80% of voters say they see themselves as either Remainers or Leavers. And there's a lot of evidence also. It means if we ask them, for example, do you talk about yourself as a group of we, or do you see would you be offended if someone talks badly about your group? Then people will agree with that. So there's a lot of evidence now showing that these are really sort of kinds of identities, that they're very stable and that they really shape how we look at the world. Now, what we focus on here, and there's also, we wrote a little piece on it in the excellent report that UK and a Changing Europe have published, is that how do they look at the consequences of Brexit? And here we see a stark divide. If we ask Leavers and Remainers, well, we ask a representative sample of the public, what do you think will be the consequences of Brexit? Leavers overwhelmingly think that the consequences will be positive, and Remainers overwhelmingly think that the consequences would be negative. So if that's how you view the world, for example, let's say you are a Leaver, why would you want to then compromise for something in the middle? Equally, if you're a Remainer and think this will be a catastrophe, again, why would you go for something that means Brexit? So I think that is very important for understanding why it's hard to split the difference on Brexit. We also did more qualitative work where we've asked tens of thousands of people on a regular basis, just asking them, in your own words, what do you think will be the consequences of Brexit? And there, reading through these statements, you really get a sense of this divide. We've also analyzed it more quantitatively, and what we see is that people who identify as Remainers, again, overwhelmingly can only think of negative consequences of Brexit. They say it will be an absolute disaster, a self-inflicted nightmare. There will be dire implications for the economy, trade and job, and it will simply be the worst thing that could happen. These are some quotes. And they're not. They're actually sort of fairly representative of the things we find. On the other hand, Leavers, while they're not as overwhelmingly positive as Remainers are negative, they're still mainly positive. So they think there will be increased prosperity and worldwide trade deals, a return of sovereignty to the UK, more control of immigration, a better life, freedom and independence. So again, we see this stark split, which I think goes some way to understanding why it is that we see that there's very little middle ground on Brexit. And so there's these sort of two contrasting worlds that I would leave you with. You know, the Empire Strike Back and Independence Day. That is how many people look at. Now we're counting down to the 29th of March. And on the other hand, you know, people stockpiling, waiting for the troops to come out on the street and being very concerned. And that is really Britain today. Very different visions of what will happen as we count down to Brexit. Thank you.
Oh dear, that's not very cheering. Jane Green from the University of Oxford.
Thank you so much. So in my 5 to 7 minutes, I'm going to try to summarise a couple of pieces of work that I've been doing with Ed Fieldhouse, Tim Helwig, and also with Rosie Shorrocks. And this is a little bit of a different take, and we've asked in the British election study some new questions, and I wanted to tell you what the kind of top-line findings is from those pieces of work. So, the question or the argument I want to make is that what is important, and one of the things that is very important for us to understand in terms of understanding public opinion, is the importance of groups in society. And I'm not going to be talking about groups in terms of whether you're a Remainer or whether you're a Leaver, but how you think about groups such as men and women, groups such as white British people, and groups such as ethnic minorities, and how you think about people in your local community, and how you think, if your local community does not happen to be in London, how you think of people who live in London. And my argument there is that Brexit helps us understand that politicians need to recognise who people think politics is working for. And so the question that I'm addressing here is, you know, what are people's perceptions about who is doing better and who is doing worse? Who is politics working for and who is politics not working for? And one of the interesting things here is that if you look back to the literature on the rise of the populist right across Western Europe, if you look to the literature that's emerging, the academic literature that's emerging, trying to explain the rise of Donald Trump, and also our own research within our own discipline, trying to, in Britain, understand the rise or the phenomenon of support for Brexit, one of the interesting debates there is how much of this support is really about race and immigration, or how much of this is really about the economy, austerity, people feeling left behind. And in my argument is, what I'm trying to say is, well, maybe this isn't the right way to think about that, because maybe if we ask people how different groups are doing in society, that kind of helps us to merge those senses of groups defined by race and the concept of who is doing better economically or not. So in the British election study, what we did is we asked people to rate how the economy has been doing in the last year. And that's a very classic way of asking about the national economy or asking people about their own personal finances. And then we also asked people to say, well, how do you think white British people have done? Have they done worse or have they done better in the last 12 years? How do you think people from ethnic minorities have done? How do you think people in your own local community have done? How do you think Londoners have fared in terms of whether the economy has done worse or badly? And I'm going to show you a figure on the assessment of ethnic minorities and white British people divided by whether people voted for Leave or Remain. And what you see here, so in red you have white British, so anything to the left of the zero is that the economy has been worse. And so Remainers thought that the economy had been worse for white British people, but the economy had been a lot worse, or significantly more worse, for people from ethnic minorities. If you're a Leave voter, however, you are more likely to think that people from ethnic minorities had done, on average, slightly better. And you are less likely to think, interestingly, that people from white British, in the white British group, insofar as we can define that, you would say that they've done worse, but you weren't saying they've done as badly as people who voted for Remain. And it's a very kind of interesting, this is a very interesting kind of set of findings if you think that actually your Leave voters might be more concerned about the economic deterioration of people from the white British category. But so what's really key here is the difference in terms of who is winning and who is losing, if you like, economically in that assessment. So we also asked about people living in London and people living in a respondent's own community, and what we found is a similar pattern. So if you're a Remain voter, you're more likely to think that the local economy had done very much worse in the last 12 months, and you are more likely to think that the London economy had done worse compared to if you're a Leave voter. If you're a Leave voter, you're actually more likely to think London was doing better on average and that the local economy was doing badly, but not as badly as if you're a Remain voter. And so, one of the very interesting findings here is that when we kind of model these assessments, we find that these are very significant and important predictors of people's voting behaviour in terms of supporting Leave or Remain. And they also stand up when we sort of take into account whether we control for all those other things that we think were important. So just simple attitudes towards immigration, people's liberal authoritarian values, people's left-right values, and so on. This is, I would argue, an important way of thinking a little bit more about how people's biases or how people's beliefs come to be important predictors of how they see the world and, as a result, how they behave in subsequent electoral choices. I mentioned that one of the interesting groups that I was interested in was men and women, and so in a slightly different way, we looked at whether people thought that there was discrimination in favour of women or against women, and in favour of men and against men. And one of the findings there was that if you perceive there to be greater discrimination against men, you're also more likely to vote for Brexit. So this starts to talk to us about that kind of a sort of broader sense of a cultural backlash that isn't just about immigration. It's also about broader social changes that have taken place in society or that are perceived to have taken place in society. And so we asked those same questions in 2 time points. We compared them to people's perceptions of discrimination against ethnic minorities and against white British people. And we looked at that change over time. And one of the interesting things that we found was that people's perceptions that there was discrimination against ethnic minorities has actually increased in that time period. So after 2016, and then going and asking people again in 2018, of course, we had the Brexit result. We had much focus in terms of what's going to happen to people living in this country, but we also had that very high-profile Windrush scandal and that story. And so we saw that people's perceptions had changed, and that sense of change tends to tell us something about the movement or some movement. It's a very small movement, but nevertheless some movement in terms of people's preferences. So people who saw that there was more discrimination against ethnic minorities in that time period who had updated their opinions were slightly more likely to vote for Remain. So that's it. My kind of bid is to think about these groups, how they matter. And one of the reasons this is important is that if you believe that some groups are benefiting to the detriment of your group, then you're going to draw on the kind of zero-sum thinking, in that sense that we can't all kind of do better together. If some group does better than another group, then that's going to, and I'm not in that group, then that's going to be a detriment to me. So I guess the kind of twofold conclusion is, I would argue that this is an important driver of part of the story behind Brexit. It's also a part of a lesson for how we move beyond Brexit to talk about perhaps not just who's winning, but more common benefits, if we could be so kind of positive and upbeat in terms of how we move forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Jane. And James, I think you're going to speak from here, are you? I've said on my notes you were going to sort of bring all these themes together.
Sorry, I don't get to go to the lecture. It's not sexism. It's just I haven't got any slides, and I haven't got any slides because I'm unlike my colleagues here. I'm not a proper expert. I run a think tank. I used to be a journalist. 2 years ago, I left a very nice, comfortable job on a big newspaper to go and run a think tank that's devoted to two things: evidence-based policy and cross-party cooperation. So,
how's that going?
we're working on it. This being a Brexit conference, we can't really have this conversation without somebody talking about David Cameron. Just listening to colleagues here, I was reminded of a conversation I had with David Cameron a few years ago when he was talking about the day Tony Blair left Downing Street, stepped down as Prime Minister. And Cameron then said, obviously I'd never say this publicly, but God, the relief I felt was enormous. Because that man was terrifying. He said, as leader of the Conservative Party, I used to get up every morning, dreading, turning on the radio, looking at my BlackBerry, to find out what's that bloody man done today to take away my voters. Because that was the reality Cameron knew he faced in Tony Blair. Now, why am I talking about this? Because Blair understood in a better way than possibly any other politician of his generation, possibly even any working today, that the spectrums and scales that we've been talking about here, whether or not it's left-right, whether or not it's liberal-authoritarian, are fluid. That there is movement along those spectrums. And if you're in politics, this is something that a lot of politicians today have forgotten. You don't just win elections and then ignore public opinion until the next election. You win elections and then you try and do things. This is the sort of policy issues I deal with every day. You then have to get consent for policies. You have to win the argument again and again and again. You keep doing politics. Now, there's a certain narratives crept into politics since the referendum that says, we won, that's it, game over, we get to do what we want. That's not how it works. You have to go on making the argument. Now, on the right-left scale, on the authoritarian-liberal scale, Blair exemplified the fact that you win by going to the centre and persuading people to come to your position. And as we've heard, particularly from Sara, that's not happening with Brexit. We are seeing what looks like a different phenomenon. We're seeing groups identifying themselves by reference to their referendum vote in 2016. And in terms of the data, the numbers, I commend very strongly to you, well, the entire document being published today, but I have a look particularly at the chapter written by Noah Carl, who has examined the way in which, or the level of knowledge that Remain and Leave voters have about the EU, but also how they answer questions asking them about their knowledge. And what he identifies is what he calls motivated reasoning. So if Leave voters are much more likely to say that Britain is to overestimate the financial contribution that that Britain makes to the EU because it fits with their worldview. Another bit of polling on that front you should have a look at was carried out by my friend and colleague Tim Bale, who's sitting at the back looking at his phone as usual. Tim did some work with YouGov last week, looking at the reasons voters give for opposing Theresa May's deal. Now, Theresa May's deal is essentially an attempt, a doomed probably attempt to find some sort of middle ground. But so Tim's YouGov polling asked those voters who were opposed to the deal, it's about half the population, why? And of that half of the population, about I think it was around 5%. So we're do the numbers. That's about, works out about 2 million people said they opposed it. They didn't know why. They just didn't like it. But yeah, and that's fair. That's perfectly reasonable. It's bloody complicated stuff. We can't necessarily expect the entire electorate to follow every dot and comma of the withdrawal agreement, the political declaration. But the point is, they answered the question by referring back to the referendum vote. That became the frame, the way they answer questions, the way they understand policy. That is a conundrum for anybody doing politics or anybody trying to promote policies. Why aren't people switching? We don't know yet. I have a theory that it's relatively easy to switch your party allegiance because if you vote for a party, it does something you don't like, you can blame it. It's much harder to switch a referendum vote because that involves admitting some degree of error. That's one of the defining features of the last couple of years. No one has been very keen to say, actually, I was wrong about my choice on either side. We're all sticking to our positions. How do politicians respond to this? I mean, so far, depressingly, is the short answer. To me, one of the most chilling documents published in recent times was the immigration white paper. Not because of the contents. I mean, which the actual policy set out there is a mixed bag. But there's a paragraph in that white paper which says essentially why we're doing this. We're doing this because the policies we are set out in this document are, and I'll quote, consistent with the public's view that migrant labour has depressed wages. Consistent with the public's view, not consistent with the evidence. All the evidence collected by the government is that migrant labour has not depressed wages. We now have a government that is setting policy on the basis of perception and not evidence. So that is where we are. That's quite grim. But actually, it's almost where I will end. I will actually try and end with a note of optimism, because in too many years hanging around politicians, writing about politics and policy, I've learned a few things. I've mostly learned that everything I think is wrong. But I've learned to be sceptical of certain ideas, and the two big ideas I always distrust. One, the argument this is different. So the idea that Brexit is a new and different cleavage is fundamentally an irresolvable binary. I'm unsure about that. Also, that this is forever. That this is the new permanent. I have a theory, optimistic, naive as it may be, that actually, if someone involved in politics were to stand up in the centre ground again and try and make an argument and suggest that the two sides of that cleavage that Sara set out there should come together and find some degree of compromise, then maybe it might just catch on. I don't know. But just a small pinch of salt. Yes, things are grim and difficult, but they may not last forever.
We're going to take some questions from the floor. Can I just quickly ask, I don't know who to quite direct this to, but it gets said a lot in politics at the moment that the only way to get out of this divide, this morass that we found ourselves in, is to have another referendum. Now, I didn't hear anything from what you said that suggests that would help, but so Sara, these identities are quite entrenched. What happens if you throw that same question back to the people again, do you think?
I think it's clear that another referendum would be divisive because we have these identities. But I guess the question back to you and to Parliament is, if not another referendum, what then?
What? Absolutely.
I mean, so it's not necessarily an ideal situation or to put the public through that again. I think what we would find would be a very heated, very divisive campaign. I don't think we know what the outcome of that would be. However, so ideally, Parliament would come together and find a solution, but at the moment that's not what we're seeing. So I think that is why many people, reasonable people who are not necessarily in favour of a second referendum, call for it not as a sort of the ideal optimal solution, but as one way out, but not the only way. But no, clearly many people on both sides would feel very strongly in a way and have very little sympathy or very little listening to the other side, and that's clearly what come out of the data, and I think what all of us have shown here today, that there are divisions, deep divisions that go beyond Brexit and that have been exacerbated by Brexit.
Paula, can I just ask you quickly to respond to James's point about perhaps someone will stand up in the centre and You don't have to bang your head on the desk, but you didn't sound as if that was a possibility you thought was very likely.
I think they just need to be a bit clearer about what they're defining as the centre. Because we've got divides, we've got a centre that's about economics, we've got a centre that's about the kind of social divide, which is the one driving Brexit. That divide is very polarised, and I agree with Sara. There isn't much of a centre on that dimension. So actually defining yourself in the centre, but then being at one end or the other of that other dimension doesn't necessarily give you a very kind of centre-y position in the end. It gives you either a Remainy position or a Levy position.
Interesting. Right, let's take some, we've got plenty of time, so let's take some questions from the floor. Gentleman in the second row there. I don't know if we have, but we do have mics. There's a mic coming towards you.
Hi, Jim Gallagher again. This is a data-related question for Jane and Paula. How much of what you're seeing is actually just the outworking of different attitudes by age? Okay, is it rather than anything else? And a second one, it's absolutely fascinating to see the different characteristics of Remain and Leave voters in the EU referendum, but they do seem to contrast with the different characteristics of yes and no voters in the Scottish independence referendum, even though both these projects are nationalist projects. Why is that so?
That's an interesting one. Who would like to? Should we take one at a time to start with? Who would like to?
Hello, Jim. Thank you for those questions. I mean, one of the things that I'm trying to do with this analysis is say, okay, let's take age into account, let's take education into account, let's take values into account, let's try to kind of move on from there and better understand kind of how these biases, perceptions, how these different kinds of truths are driving people's preferences. So this isn't just the outworking of the age effect or the generation effect. This is something more than that. And I think, in terms of what I'm talking about, it goes to what James was saying. Why is it that government's making policy on the basis of people's beliefs? Well, the next question is, why do people have those beliefs about the threat of immigration, about in terms of the labour market, in terms of all sorts of other things? Well, they have those beliefs because maybe they have them because of their local context, maybe they have them because they have predispositions to have them that might be generated by age, but they also have them because people tell them these things a lot. And this goes back to your question about, if we had another referendum, it's kind of the key thing there is like what's said during it, how are people's fears? So I'm talking about kind of fears and biases and prejudices that are rising, taking age and education, all those other things into account.
And on the Scottish referendum, has anyone looked at that at all? And the different ways the argument laid out?
Yeah, I mean, that's a huge question.
There's a whole project for someone there, isn't there?
Yeah, no, it's a huge question. And I'm not sure I can do it justice in the short time period. But obviously what's really important in Scotland, without, putting to one side loads of other really important factors, is the question of Scottish nationalism and that sense of identity. And, the way that the Scottish independence referendum cross-cut party lines and, how that obviously played out in the independence referendum, subsequently in the general election in Scotland. So I think we're not dealing with the same kind of national identity, but we're dealing with important identities. And as Sara said, and as Paula said, these are driven by values, and they're driven by, a sense of, very, very strong preferences around Leave and Remain. So, there are similarities, there are very key differences, and I would point to the question of, adherence to the beliefs around Scottish nationalism as one of the key differences. But obviously, that is a big question.
It's interesting. Again, it gets played out almost every week at Prime Minister's Questions when Ian Blackford from the SNP asks the Prime Minister, why would you tear us away, from this very successful economic bloc? And she says, well, why would you tear Scotland away from this, from the UK? And they talk past each other about it at regular intervals. Is the lady there? Oh, the mic right near you. Perfect.
Fantastic. My name's Christabel Cooper. I'm not an academic, though I am a data analyst. There's been quite a narrative that's grown up that Brexit voting is related to austerity. I thought what was fascinating about Professor Green's figures was that actually Leave voters appeared to have a less grim attitude to what had happened to the economy in the last 12 years than Remain voters, which seems to slightly argue against that. And yet, what you're saying is that what's important to them is that they feel that they are doing less well than other groups. Given that actually all the data says that white people do better better than ethnic minorities. Men do better than women. I mean, the traditional left answer to Brexit is, oh, well, you know, we've got to give lots of money to these left behind communities. But actually, what you're suggesting is that the answer is to give more money towards groups that are already actually doing quite well, and that's what will make these people less pissed off. I just wondered what your thoughts on how do we persuade them that that this is not the case when given that all the data is arguing against it.
James? You seem like you might want to, or Jane, do you want to? Yeah.
Apparently, to get Jane, then I'll
Okay, so does austerity drive Leave votes? Right. So that's the number one question.
There's another project for someone.
No, I mean, it's a huge, sorry to repeat myself. This is, you know, again, this is a massive question. There's a big debate about whether this is true. Because if you look at the aggregate level, you'll see a relationship between areas that are, you know, less economically successful and Leave vote. And the question is, does that drill down to people's actual preferences and actual beliefs and actual experiences? And if you go and measure it in lots of ways in terms of people's income losses or people's economic insecurity, you'll find that, you know, immigration concerns tend to outweigh those kinds of factors. And that's, you know, so there's a very live debate about this in terms of both support for Donald Trump, which is where this debate also takes place, and also for Brexit. And, you know, new emerging evidence starts to point to, you know, much more kind of fine-grained details about the contextual level. I'm doing another project eventually when I can find time to look at, you know, do people even really understand, and can people really articulate accurately or even at all, you know, that sense of long-term decline as well, which is argued to be at the very kind of heart of these kinds of, you know, you could turn around and say, well, actually, you know, you're not measuring it right. What you really need is this kind of long-term demise kind of factor. Well, if people don't really see it and can't really answer it and can't really, you know, relate to those concepts, then where are we left with those kinds of explanations? I think that what I'm saying is that what matters is people's beliefs and people's fears. And so if you scare people about, you know, the threat of others, they're more likely to see one person's gain as another's loss. I'm not necessarily saying that policy making has to favour different groups. I mean, unless they have greater needs and so on and so forth, and that's, you know, a totally different motivation. You know, I don't think we should be putting money into people's, into various different, you know, demographics in society because of public opinion and because of concerns. The question is how you get away from making people believe that one group's gain is another's loss, that you are threatened if another person is perceived, and whether even those things are true. So I think it's much more about rhetoric and dialogue, and that's not something I engage in, so I'm absolved of...
So it's not your fault. So
just to follow up on what Jane has said, there is clearly a sort of socio-demographic divide in the Brexit vote and in Brexit identities, but it's not clearly this sort of poor versus rich. What we see both at the aggregate level and individual level, it's much more clearly a sort of education divide, and that's also why Jane's work is very important, is, you know, and it's also sort of geographical. So it's a sort of urban areas that look very different, even though some urban areas are quite poor, look very, very different from the towns and the rural areas. So there is a relationship between, you know, where are you in this new knowledge economy? Do you feel, even if you're not poor, you can still feel left behind from globalization, from multiculturalism. So it's not that it doesn't have a root in the economy, but it's not a simple, oh, if you're poor, you voted Leave, and if you're rich, you voted Remain. That's not the story. I mean, it's much more about education, about geography, and about age.
James, if you're a minister sitting there in Whitehall, it's not obvious how you respond. Is it one way to respond is to publish an immigration white paper and say,
yes,
you think this and therefore we're going to respond to it?
Yes, and yeah, on this question about add to the bonfire on austerity as a cause of Brexit. To advertise my someone's motioning at me to talk more to the microphone. At the risk of advertising alternative academic work, at the Social Market Foundation, we're actually next month going to be publishing some work with our colleagues at Warwick University, looking at the correlation between austerity in terms of local government spending and UKIP, and the propensity to the UKIP vote. So that there are other measures of the impact of austerity other than household income. But I mean, the essential point, yes. I mean, how do you respond? I mean, and this comes back to immigration, and part of the reason why I ended my little talk earlier on a slightly optimistic note is because if you think back 7 or 8 years ago, there was an idea that opposition to immigration was implacable. It was the immovable rock in the centre of British politics. And actually, if you look at the evidence, the polling evidence today, that is not the case. That immigration, and the following session will play this out. Views to immigration on immigration are a lot more nuanced, a lot more complex than they were taken to be. And to harp on my earlier point again, the great frustration and failing of the immigration conversation, and actually, which to a large extent led us into the referendum and put us in this room today, was that a lot of politicians who could understand the economic and often social benefits of immigration either did not or could not properly articulate those arguments and build policies on the basis of them. So it is the case that a relatively liberal immigration policy adds to aggregate GDP. It is also the case that the way in which that benefit is distributed at a local level is probably not consistent with helping the left behind communities who are most likely to vote for Brexit. And that failure came about because of the unwillingness to engage with what looked like a big, terrifying monolithic block of opinion. Because we can't you can't touch that issue; you'll get killed by angry voters.
And as you say, more on immigration in the next session. Gentleman here. Should we take a couple? Should we take this gentleman here, and there's another gentleman with glasses there at the back who's had his hand up for a while, I think, haven't you? 2 gentlemen with glasses, in fact, yeah. Hello.
Hello, my name is Wagler. I am a bit puzzled by all this Brexit business, I have to admit, but why
We all are.
But why don't we separate membership of an organization like the EU and use of a treaty? I mean, the treaty we have today, the TEU and the TFEU and all the other things we have with the EU, is separate. You never voted on that. You only voted on membership of the European Union. And there is an article in Article 50.3, which was ratified by the UK government or by the UK Parliament in March 2008. It says, the European Council, in agreement with the member state concerned, can unanimously decide to extend the period that the treaties are valid. You have to separate these two things, membership of and the treaty.
Okay, no one at Westminster quite seems to have thought of that one, but that's an interesting point.
It says so in the treaty that you have ratified as part of the domestic laws.
Okay.
UK domestic laws.
Okay. And there was another one at the back. Hello.
Yeah, my name is Steve Freeman. I was just talking about identities. It seems that people in England who think of themselves as English are more likely to vote to leave, and those people who think they're British were more likely to vote to remain. Now, I'm in a strange position that just like people give up alcohol in January, I gave up being British in January, and I don't describe myself as that anymore. I think there's an English...
Formally, or do you just
Just formally. Just in my own consciousness, in my identity, if I like, talk about identities.
Right.
So I think of myself as an Anglo-European, and it goes back to the Scottish question, because if you go to Scotland, the people who think of themselves as British in Scotland are more likely to have been leavers, and the people who think of themselves as being Scottish in Scotland are more likely to go on the Remain side, because the SNP sees itself as a Scottish European country, as Ireland sees itself as an Irish European country. So where are the English Europeans?
Well, some of them are outside Parliament with with berets and flags, I have to say, but we never saw very many of them before the referendum. That's certainly true. Paula, did you want to talk about that one?
The mic there. Try and talk about both of them very briefly. The point about the treaty, you're making very complex points, and I think the chapter that's already been referred to in the report shows that actually the understanding to be able to grasp those kinds of points in the general public, which is who we're talking about here is simply not there, and those kinds of complex questions are not ones that we should necessarily be putting directly to the public, that actually those are the kinds of things that perhaps need to be decided before we get to the point of a referendum, rather than worried about afterwards. On the British and English identity, so one thing that I've been trying to look at this recently, and I've been using the British election study data. Now, they ask the question differently on the two different data sets, which is nice because it lets you compare them. And we've got used to using the question that allows you to choose British or English and kind of have to trade off against them. But on one of the online panels, you have two different questions that ask about the strength of those two identities independently. So you say how strongly you feel you're English, you say how strongly British you feel. It's about 7 in 10 of those who feel strongly English that also feel strongly British. So it's not the simple opposition that we get by looking at some of the other questions. And that's something that I think needs more thought in terms of how it then plays out into attitudes.
Okay. Interesting. Oh, did you want to?
I was just going to actually briefly add to that.
You found a chart.
Yeah, there is a chart in the report you've all got. I strongly recommend you look at something which frankly terrifies me. Page 43. Now, I used to be Scottish, in that I used to work for the Scotsman, and so I have quite an interest in questions of of the union, and I'm quite attached to it. Now, that chart shows you that. Of the English electorate, a majority think that Scottish independence, of the Leave voting English electorate, a majority think that Scottish independence is a price worth paying to accomplish Brexit. And I think, if I'm reading it right, 45% of the Leave voting English electorate think that unravelling peace in Northern Ireland is a price worth paying to accomplish Brexit. Now, that is one of the great missing elements of this conversation, that the extent to which Brexit has placed a real question mark over the survival of the union, the blessed union, the precious union, which no one is talking about, and I really wish they'd talk about more.
Sara, did you want to?
Well, just on the treaties, putting on my hat as a professor of European institutions, of course, joining the EU is joining the treaties. So then the question becomes, should the UK have had referendums every time there was a treaty amendment? And we do have some experience of that. The Irish and the Danes do it frequently. And so I think thinking that somehow if you vote on the amendment of the treaties, which Blair, by the way, wanted with the constitutional treaty, that does not become a bigger question about the future of the EU, about the economy, all the things that we've seen in this, that's not the evidence. The evidence is exactly that even if you vote quite narrowly on a specific treaty, it becomes a much bigger question about exactly what kind of future do we want. So that's the experience from the rest of Europe.
So it would become very hard to separate those two. Any more? Have we got some over this side? Everyone over this side is very quiet. Oh, look at that lady there, hand shot up, and a gentleman a few rows in front. Where? Yeah, over here.
Thank you. I'm Mary Daszewski, a journalist. I've got a wider question, really. John Curtis spoke about the difficulty of finding a consensus, and everybody here has spoken about a values contrast or sort of tribalism. How far do you think that's unique to the UK or maybe to England? And how far is it replicated in other European countries, and it's simply that the UK has been subject to greater scrutiny because of the Brexit referendum? Thanks.
Interesting. There's a guy here.
Hi, Alex Brayley, FCO. I just wondered if the panel had any insights into how Brexit and this question of identity. So first of all, I think you're absolutely right that there's quite clearly a sort of identity around Remain and Leave has developed. How that compares with perhaps very divisive issues British politics has had to deal with in the past. So I'm thinking, this is slightly before my time, but maybe the Iraq War. And then going on from there, how long these identities are likely to endure? Will they really disappear sort of 1 minute, midnight post-Brexit, or is this likely to sort of define and shape politics for the next generation, or for those who voted in the referendum, is it a lifetime thing? Thank you.
It's a question a lot of people are asking themselves, I think. You've just made us all feel a bit old up here on the panel, I think. But apart from that, who wants to take those? Paula, on the identities,
Yeah.
Right.
So particularly the question about it being unique to the UK, it certainly isn't unique to the UK. We see similar things, similar divides happening across Europe, but elsewhere in Europe, the electoral system has allowed a bit more room to move so that the parties can represent these interlocking value systems more easily, whereas we are much more locked into a kind of winner takes all to I think of them almost like dinosaurs, which perhaps isn't the greatest analogy, kind of butting heads constantly, rather than being able to represent these more subtle positions and work that out through the party system.
Interesting. And on the idea of whether these are identities that will endure?
I mean, I think in a sense, Paula has also, I think, indirectly addressed that with her evidence, because it's exactly showing that there is a sort of the wound that you referred to, this underlying value division. It's not just Brexit, in a sense, has become the thing that people have latched onto, that has sort of crystallized that. And one of the reasons it wasn't crystallized is exactly, as Paula has also said, that there aren't the parties representing it, because the parties on the value dimension are internally split. Also, of course, you know that on the 29th of March when we leave, that doesn't mean the Brexit discussion is over. So, I mean, that would be wishful thinking. I'm sure a lot of us would wish it to be, but this will go on. But I think the fact that there is this underlying value divide means it will last longer. The question is, what kind of realignment will we see of parties? I think we don't know yet. Will parties sort of take very distinct position, or will they sort of try and do as they do now and remain these coalition of these very divided publics?
Jane?
And just in response to both questions, I guess, if, you know, when we look at kind of how dimensions or how different opinions, identities, these different kinds of divides matter, they matter because people polarize, so people take very, very different views on them. They matter because they become salient, and so they become the thing that really matters. And so, you know, one of the things I know Paula's done, and John also, is looked at, you know, the kind of relative importance of this divide in relation to left-right. So it's not to say left-right doesn't matter anymore, it's just that there's this other divide. So, you know, we think about kind of how important this is, but as Sara also said, we think about how relevant in terms of the choices that voters then come to make. So if we look at the UK in a comparative context, of course, what's happened in Britain is all those things have happened at once. And so you have, you know, polarisation, it's very, very important, it's the biggest thing, but also there is a choice on the basis of it. So if you want to think about what would have to change for that not to be the case, then one of those or all of those or some combination of those factors would need to alter.
In terms of kind of parties and how they respond, the timing of the next general election matters a lot, doesn't it? It seems to me. I think that's one of the calculations going on at the moment is you know, which side of the Brexit divide do we put ourselves on, or how do we put ourselves on both sides? And that matters a lot more if you're looking at an election in short order rather than in several years' time. A couple more, two next to each other. Martin and the gentleman in front. You could pass the mic between you.
Well, I'll start. I'm John Peet from The Economist. I wanted really to follow up Mary's question. I mean, many people said after a 52-48 vote, you should naturally reach for a compromise. And what we heard in the first session, and again here, is that compromise seems almost impossible. Compromise on something that might look a bit more like you leave, but you stay close, Norway, Switzerland, or whatever. My question really is, how did it work in Norway and Switzerland? I mean, they seem to have been able to compromise, and the issue of membership of the European Union doesn't seem to be one that bothers them anymore. Why doesn't it work here?
Interesting. Martin?
I just wanted to go... Martin Kettle, Heather's colleague from The Guardian. I just wanted to go back to Jane Green's slides about economic judgment, about whether things had got worse or better, which I think, as somebody else pointed out, that illustrated very powerfully that a lot of Remain voters didn't think things were going terribly well in Britain in 2016 economically, and yet one of the kind of arguments that that's entered into the politics of all this is that Remainers are all doing very nicely, thank you, and Leavers are all the left behind. I just wondered, there wasn't much optimism on either side, and does this explain perhaps why the Remain campaign failed? Because it was actually, it didn't speak to pessimism, and and tried to frighten people still more, and that worked out as exacerbating the Leave divide, the salient feature of the Leave divide, which is somebody else is benefiting at your expense, which on the whole, from what your slide showed, didn't seem to be the case so much with Remainers.
Okay, should we start with the Swiss and the Norwegians? Why are they not rowing about this? Norwegians have got a bloody great sovereign wealth fund, which probably helps to paper over a lot of cracks, I would have thought. But, Sara?
Yeah, I mean, it always helps being incredibly wealthy. No, I mean, less jokingly, of course, I mean, as Jane said, I mean, one of the things, why do these sort of divisions become so salient? And one thing is, you know, when it's highly politicized and you have to have a choice, and the Norwegians and the Swiss have not had to directly choose on this, the EU sort of question since the mid-1900s, so it has been depoliticized. Of course, there are still things that are highly divisive that are along the same value divide, which is along the sort of a previous question. For example, immigration. In Switzerland, they've had referendums of freedom of movement. It was highly divisive, but the EU question is not on the table. And also, there's a question of political leadership. What do the political leaders in Norway and Switzerland do, even when there are referendums? So, for example, the freedom of movement referendum in Switzerland, what they do is saying, okay, we're going to basically find a fudge that means that we can stay very close to the single market, sort of almost de facto in the single market, that our economy is working incredibly well, but that we're not directly sort of saying, oh no, you're not being listened to. I mean, and that fudge, when things are depoliticized, have worked, but it is, so it's sort of below the surface, the issue of EU membership explicitly, but there are of course still divisions in, you know, both countries on some of the underlying value dimensions.
Just to follow up on that point, really. There's a tendency sometimes to see where we are today as inevitable. And if you think back to the summer of 2016, the sort of six or 8 weeks after the referendum, there was visible there the sort of compromise you're talking about. And actually, if you to go really into the weeds of Conservative Party history, the reason Boris Johnson is not Prime Minister today is because Michael Gove killed him. The reason Michael Gove killed him is because Boris Johnson, 5 days after the referendum, wrote a column for the Daily Telegraph. I was editing the column at the time, in which he essentially outlined exactly the sort of compromise you're talking about. He talked about the single market, he talked about freedom of movement, he talked about a sort of Brexit that would essentially have tried to reconcile the 52% and the 48%. And his dear friend and colleague Michael Gove decided this was a betrayal of everything they'd fought for, and therefore Boris had to die. The point is political leadership. Yeah, there is nothing inevitable about where we are today. If certain people had done things differently in those weeks and months after the referendum, if somebody hadn't resigned and run away, if Michael Gove hadn't killed Boris Johnson, if Theresa May hadn't essentially broken that nascent consensus around the single market with her Red Line speech at party conference, we might well be in a very different place. If leaders had led, they didn't. We are where we are.
I also wonder whether after the general election, 2017 general election, whether there was another moment where perhaps, looking at the new shape of the parliament, you could have done something a little bit more consensus. What about this issue of optimism and pessimism? You know, and whether the Remainers are optimistic or pessimistic, or what, Jane?
So one thing I should point out is that the questions that I presented here are asked after the referendum, so there's a little bit of after-the-fact bias in terms of people's evaluations of the economy. So that's one thing to take into account, and we have to do that, and we had to do it after the fact because that's when we had the idea. So we have to take that into account. So that's one sort of caveat. But that caveat aside, if you look at, sort of looking backwards, that's slightly more reliable than looking forwards economically, because economically looking forwards, you're going to say, well, it's going to be all terrible because we're leaving the EU, or it's going to be all wonderful because we're leaving the EU. So let's, say that we can trust that enough. So the next thing is, well, how did people across the board evaluate all of those kinds of different economic changes? And I had another slide, couldn't fit it in, showing that on average, it was quite negative across the board. So people thought the country had done worse, they had done worse on average, white British people had done worse, and ethnic minorities had done worse. And it sort of brings me back to that other question earlier about austerity, which is, we have to remember, perhaps there's a sort of very interesting way in which austerity is working. We're in a climate where the degree to which people were reflecting back was actually quite negative. I suppose, that's kind of an important thing to remember when we're thinking about, do Remainers think that everything was absolutely hunky-dory for them or for the country? And then I think there's another point which sort of relates to a presentation that Paula gave recently in Oxford, talking about how, and Sara reminded us that, what's really important here is education when we think about left behind and so on, is, how does that education variable work? Could it be, and I don't know if this is true, but could it be possible that one of the reasons Remain voters who were higher educated were more pessimistic about the economy was that they tended to, be better informed about the economy, or they tended to have a different propensity to evaluate the economy differently anyway. But I think your point is very well made, is that, some of those very simplistic readings of the role of economic evaluations and who is doing better and worse, I think, are certainly challenged by these data.
So it does suggest that a sort of "don't rock the boat" campaign maybe wasn't quite the, or "don't upset the apple cart" maybe wasn't quite the message. So, Sara, did you want to?
We have actually done some research looking at the economic perceptions by Leavers and Remainers, and what's fascinating is with the brilliant work that Jane is doing in the British election study. So they track these things amazingly over time. And what's fascinating is that up to the referendum vote, Leavers and Remainers actually weren't different in how they viewed the economy, yet the sort of aggregate economy. And then as soon as the referendum happened, Remainers become incredibly pessimistic. And if there are any Remainers in the room, you might think, yeah, well, that's of course, because things were terrible after. But it could also be part of this that we've all talked about, that you see things through a certain lens, and all of a sudden you're the loser, you think everything is going to crash and burn, so it certainly has burned. So there's a fascinating sort of shift that happens right after the referendum. And since then, Remainers have been very pessimistic.
You've got just a few more minutes. Should we just take one more little quick batch? There's a lady there. And we're all much chattier on this side. And a gentleman along the row, so you could maybe pass the mic along. Thank you.
Sorry, just about to drop my laptop.
Don't do that.
No, rescued it. Pam Tatlow. I just wondered to what extent you think the polarisation is such that it's taken over a rather dewy-eyed view of the EU. I.e., there are critiques that you can make of the EU and some of its policies in terms of the UK, but can we assume that that debate is completely off the table? Mind you, I would also say that some Leavers might have been correct in, for example, not in a detailed way, but in a nuanced way about some of the effects of EU policies on the UK. I mean, I'm not arguing a Leave position, but I think the debate is somewhat more nuanced about the EU than we sometimes suggest. But I'm not sure we can get back to that.
No, I was going to say we seem to have lost sight of nuance some time ago, didn't we? Unfortunately, but it's a good question, and gentlemen here, just to want to stop. Oh, great, thank you.
Yeah, I'm going to give the Leave position because I'm hearing quite strange things. First of all, compromise. If Remain had won this referendum, one of the reasons there's division is because if they won it by 52-48 for Remain, there wouldn't be a compromise. It would be all Remain and Leave would have to shut up. That's the reality. So why we have to compromise when we won, I don't know. The other reason there's a lot more division now is because we have a Remain-facing Prime Minister dealing with a Leave process, and most Leave voters don't trust her, frankly. And that is why there's division, because people on the Leave side, most of them, regardless why they voted Leave, are suspicious of the establishment. And I'm quite comfortably off. I didn't vote because I'm one of the left behind. I just think there is an element of suspicion that when Cameron said, we will implement what you decide, we're still waiting, and we are suspicious that they'll try and stop it. That's why there's division. Could I have a response to that point, please?
Who wants to take?
I'm delighted to speak up for compromise.
I think, yeah.
But before I get to that, I'll just note the fascinating observation about the establishment. Again, one of my former colleagues is Charles Moore, Eton, Cambridge Daily Telegraph. Charles is terrified of the establishment. He thinks the establishment are going to take away his Brexit. I think I don't say this entirely to mock him, but I think it's a very interesting strand background of the conversation, the idea that everybody on both sides sees a more powerful group of people out there who will deny them their wish. Briefly, why do you have to compromise? Because that's how politics works. It doesn't stop, and this is but what you're articulating is the problem of a referendum in a parliamentary system, particularly a purely binary referendum. The reason you have to compromise is because to gain consent to enact policies, you have to take other people with you. You don't just say we won, that's it, everybody shuts up. Governments don't win elections and then demand and receive total obedience for the duration of the parliament. That's the game, I'm afraid.
Anyone else? Anyone on nuance and how well the sort of nuanced arguments go across? It's interesting, there was a lot of criticism of Labour's Remain campaign for not being sufficiently enthusiastic, but in some ways the sort of the tone of it, which was, well, we're not great fans of the EU, but probably best stay in. Maybe it was slightly closer to public opinion, I don't know, than don't upset the apple cart. But nuance? Anyone? Yeah, go on.
It reminds me of this. I mean, there isn't a lot of nuance, and I mean, the more polarized we get, the less of that, and there's very little space for that. Of course, there are many, many things you can criticize the EU for, but I also agree. I mean, one of the things that wasn't really in the first referendum campaign was much of a positive case of the EU. It really became about other things. But in terms of the nuance, I never forget. I think Corbyn did an interview where he was asked, how strongly do you feel about staying in the EU? And he said, sort of a 6 or a 7 on a 10-point scale. And I thought, well, I mean, it might not be nuanced, but it's also not very enthusiastic.
Jane?
Just the point about how people think about the EU, it's kind of, there's a whole new question moving forward, right? Which is one, how much does the outcome of this process how much of that positive or negative is attributed to the EU? So moving forward, who blames the EU for a failure of negotiation or for a bad deal, or who blames Theresa May? And I think that will be crucial. I think the other thing that will be crucial moving forward is I don't know what's going to happen, clearly, but let's say it's not positive economically, or that there is a major disturbance in terms of a massive policy shock, and we live through that for maybe it's a short period of time, maybe it's a long period of time. To what degree do people look at the rest of Europe and look at the counterfactual of what would have been? And clearly, those two things are going to be key questions, and the degree to which the public is persuaded in either direction will, of course, be very strongly influenced by how people voted and what their beliefs are about the EU. But I think those are the two things to watch as we go ahead.
I think we've got lots to watch. I think it's been a really good conversation, and I've learnt a lot, and I can see the next panel sort of massing on the sidelines over there, and I have to get back to watching the dinosaurs picking at an old wound. So sadly, so yuck. So perhaps we could say thanks to the panel, Paula, Surridge and Sara, Hobolt and Jane Green and James Kirkup.